Yeah, hello again, Dr. Lontridge. Apparently my video cut out, and so I stopped here on the first video. I have 6 or 7 more slides. I'm going to go through it again, and I think I'm pretty much done on this one. Um, I think. So this is the next one, and what you see here is a nice illustration of the communication between two cells. Here's a web address for a video version of this. Um, So we have electrical impulse coming from an axon, arrives here at this axon terminal and causes the release of a chemical called a neurotransmitter. And there are a lot of different types of neurotransmitters in different kinds of cells of the nervous system. I'm not interested in having you remember those. Those neurotransmitters have a job, and that job is to signal the downstream cell to begin a contraction, or I should say an electrical signal. So the neurotransmitters bind to specific sites on the surface of the postsynaptic cell, and they will trigger an event. It could actually be inhibition, that is to say, shut something down, but it also could activate something like a muscle contraction, for example. Here's an illustration of what a snake bite might do to you. There's a type of snake, I can't remember the name of it. One bite kills 250,000 animals, mice in this case. What does that do? Well, actually, the chemical that it produces in its saliva will actually make its way into this space here, this synaptic space, and will block the signaling between these two cells. Okay, this is a good slide. I like this one. This is an illustration of a circuit, and I'm going to begin by saying this is a overly simplified version of the circuit. Typically, when we have circuitry in the nervous system, we're involving many dozens, hundreds, thousands of cells in a single circuit. But this is the best way to think about it because it does include all the players. And it's a clean illustration. So first of all, circuit is going in this direction. And it begins over here with receptor cells. So all sorts of receptor cells in and on in our body. Some of those receptor cells are picking up signals from the outside. Some of those receptor cells are picking up signals from the inside. And we call them sensory cells. And the sensory cells then will communicate with sensory neurons. And the communication is electrical to chemical. So there's chemical communication between this sensory cell and this sensory neuron, or if you want this receptor cell and this sensory neuron. That will trigger an electrical signal in the sensory neuron, which then communicates with a interneuron. This is peripheral nervous system. This is peripheral nervous system. This is central nervous system. Interneurons are in the central nervous system only, the brain or the spinal cord, and they're kind of like routing centers. So they'll route a signal from sensory neuron to the appropriate motor neuron. The motor neuron receives a chemical signal from at the synapse here, and then we'll have an electrical signal that travels to some other place, like a muscle or a gland cell. By the way, these red pinkish things, those are called Schwann cells, and if you've ever had neurobio, you know what those are for. If you haven't, I'm not going to tell you. It's not worth spending the time and the amount of time that we have in this class. So that's a circuit, and that's a nervous system circuit. Now I want to move on and talk about endocrine systems and endocrine system circuits. And remember the point at the beginning, like there are things I want you to be able to tell that are different about these two systems. And one of them is how they work. So this slide right here does a good job of that. Cell-producing hormone in a gland, like the hypothalamus or the adrenal glands, producing a hormone. The hormone goes into the bloodstream, and that bloodstream carries the hormone all around the body, and eventually it'll target a cell. and that cell is called the target, or is a target cell. And that cell is a target because it has receptors that are sensitive to the hormone that is being released in the blood. There are two kinds of hormones. There are peptide hormones and lipid-based hormones. I'm not going to draw a distinction here, but I'm going to give you an example of peptide. Peptide hormones have to bind to surface receptors. Lipid-based hormones, like testosterone, can go inside the cell, but peptide hormones like insulin have to bind to the surface of the cell. So insulin is being produced inside the pancreas. Pancreas then releases the insulin into the bloodstream. Bloodstream carries the insulin molecules all around the body, and two places of particular importance are the liver and muscles of the body that have receptors for insulin. Once those receptors bind to those cells, the cells will bring glucose transporters to their surfaces that will increase the absorption of glucose from the blood into the cells. Now think about this. This is a negative feedback system. Why is that a negative feedback system? Because if insulin is produced only when sugar levels are too high, and what happens is that when insulin is produced, eventually sugar levels go down. So that's a negative feedback. Stimulus increases sugar, response decrease sugar. And there you go. Next slide. Next slide is this one. This slide is an illustration of how varied and how complex the nervous system or endocrine system functions are. I'm not going to have you memorize this. I don't want you to memorize this. I do want you to remember that there's a pretty big difference between what the endocrine system is doing and what the nervous system is doing. There are endocrine glands, and here are some of them. I might have you use these in your test because I have open book exam, but I'm not going to have you memorize them, obviously. Here's the way it works in more detail. I'm not going to go through that just because I've already done it. I do want to answer this question. It's like, how much hormone is being produced? And as it turns out, it's like 10 trillion molecules, which is a lot. I mean, there are only 10 billion people on this planet, so it's like 1,000 times more molecules inside of your body in insulin than there are people on this planet. But how much is that actually? Well, take a look at this. This is my way of figuring it out. So imagine you have 1 grain of sugar, one little crystal. You're holding in your hand. You can barely see it. Cut that into 1,000 pieces, and cut that into 1,000 pieces, and you've got 1 trillion molecules, or actually 10 trillion molecules. That's how little there is of this hormone that's doing a lot in your body. And I mention this because we'll be covering in another material on the second homework assignment something called endocrine disruptors. It doesn't take a lot of endocrine disruptors to have really dramatic effects in your body. And that's illustrated here. Hormones do not have to be really abundant in order for them to do some really important things. All right, I finish off with this interaction slide. The endocrine system and nervous system can be thought of as separate systems of communication, but they do interact in places, and here's one illustration. So this is an example that you might see on an exam. So try to remember this, or listen to the video. So you see something scary, right? A bear, a shark, I don't know, python. And that will trigger an event in the sensory cell, the receptor cell, which will cause neurotransmitters to be released and cause an electrical signal to be produced in the sensory neuron. Sensory neuron then produces neurotransmitters that are released and bind to surface receptors on interneuron, which will produce an electrical signal that travels to motor neurons, and motor neurons then will have electrical signals travel down here that will bind to something else. What is that something else? Something else is the adrenal gland. The adrenal gland is just above the kidney. So this is all starting in the head, travels down to the kidneys, and the adrenal glands are releasing two hormones. Now, the only one I'm interested in here is the one that's at the top, adrenaline. Adrenaline is released, and it causes all sorts of changes inside the body, traveling through the circulatory system. It affects blood pressure by constricting the blood vessels, increases heart rate, increases dilation of bronchioles, so you breathe more clearly, and it also breaks down glycogen into glucose to give you more fuel, because all these things have to happen if you're going to run away from that bear. Okay, that's all I have. Thanks.